There is a community living right now in the United States of America on a chain of barrier islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and they speak a language that linguists cannot fully explain. They follow food laws that match no African tradition on record. They name their children using a naming system that anthropologists have traced back thousands of years, not to West Africa, but to the ancient Near East. And when genetic scientists ran their DNA, they found something that made researchers go quiet. This is not a theory from the internet. This is not a religious claim. This is peer-reviewed science, census records, slave ship logs, and the words of the people themselves, pointing to an origin story that the history books you grew up reading never once mentioned. My name is not important right now. What is important is what happened to the Gullah Geechee people and what their story reveals about a chapter of history that somebody, somewhere, decided you were never supposed to know. Stay with me, because this one will change the way you see American history forever. If you have never heard of the Gullah Geechee people, you are not alone, and that erasure, that silence, is actually part of the story. The Gullah Geechee are an African-American community concentrated along the coastal lowlands and sea islands, stretching from the northern tip of North Carolina down through South Carolina, Georgia, and into the northern edge of Florida. Their territory is not a metaphor, it is a mapped, documented geographic zone. The federal government officially recognized the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor in 2006. That corridor encompasses over 12,000 square miles. These people did not simply survive the American slave trade, they survived it on islands, physically cut off from the mainland by salt marshes, tidal creeks, and the Atlantic Ocean itself. The sea islands became something extraordinary, an accidental preservation chamber. While plantation owners preferred the mainland, the sea islands were left largely to enslaved communities to manage themselves. Rice and indigo plantations ran on these islands, but the day-to-day lives of the enslaved Africans there operated with a degree of cultural autonomy that was nearly impossible anywhere else in the antebellum South. The result was a people who retained more of their African cultural identity than virtually any other African-American community in the United States. Anthropologists who visited the sea islands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries described what they found as staggering. Here was a community that had been enslaved, brutalized, transported across an ocean, and yet had held on to something that even they, in many cases, could no longer fully explain. Let's start with the language, because the language is where this story gets undeniable. Gullah, also called Gullah Geechee Creole, is a Creole language, meaning it blends elements of English with multiple African language structures. For most of the 20th century, linguists cataloged Gullah as a straightforward African English Creole, similar to Creole languages found in the Caribbean. But the more linguists dug in, the more they found anomalies, features that did not fit the standard Creole model. Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner was the first serious linguistic scholar to study Gullah in depth. His landmark work, Africanisms in the Gullah dialect, cataloged over 4,000 African words still surviving in the Gullah vocabulary. 4,000 words in a community that had been enslaved for over 2 centuries. Turner traced the vast majority of these words to specific language families: Mende, Vai, Twi, Hausa, Yoruba, Fula, all languages of the West African coastal and Senegambian region. But Turner also documented something he could not fully explain, certain structural elements of Gullah grammar that pointed east, not to sub-Saharan Africa, but to Semitic language structures. Now, before you dismiss that, understand what a Semitic language structure means. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Arabic is a Semitic language. Aramaic is a Semitic language. These languages share grammatical architecture, the way verbs are built from three-letter roots, the way sentences are ordered, the way plurality and possession are marked. Turner noted, and later scholars confirmed, that Gullah shows traces of these patterns in ways that simple English-African contact cannot explain. The question that nobody in mainstream academia has ever satisfactorily answered is this: how do you get Semitic grammatical residue in a Creole language spoken by people who were supposedly brought entirely from West Africa? Drop a comment right now. Do you think this is a coincidence, or does this point to something deeper? To understand who the Gullah Geechee are, you have to understand where they were taken from. And this is where the historical record becomes very specific. The slave trade to the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country was not random. Plantation owners in this region had a known preference, documented in slave auction records and planter correspondence, for enslaved people from a specific zone of West Africa. That zone was the Rice Coast, present-day Sierra Leone, Guinea, Senegal, and the Gambia River Valley, a region historians today call Sen-Gambia. Why this preference? Because the rice cultivation technology that made South Carolina's plantation economy so profitable originated in this exact region. Plantation owners in South Carolina literally sought out people from the Rice Coast because those people knew how to grow rice in tidal floodplains. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate economic extraction of a knowledge system. Now here is where the story deepens. The Sen-Gambia region, the precise origin zone of the majority of Gullah ancestors, was not an ethnically homogeneous area. It was a corridor through which over centuries multiple population groups had migrated, settled, and blended. And among those populations, documented by Arab geographers as early as the 9th and 10th century CE, were communities practicing customs that outside observers consistently described as neither fully animist nor fully Islamic. These communities observed food prohibitions, practiced ritual cleansing before communal meals, organized society around patrilineal clan structures with specific inheritance laws, and observed a seventh-day rest period. Now, some historians have argued these are Islamic influences, and Islam is indeed present in this region. But the specific combination of practices, and crucially, the time depth, predates the Islam conversion of much of Sen-Gambia, which did not become widespread until the 17th and 18th centuries. The practices we're discussing were recorded by travelers and geographers in the 11th and 12th centuries, before Islam had achieved dominance in the interior of this region. So the question becomes, where did these practices originate? When anthropologists began systematically studying the Gullah Geechee community in the early 20th century, they documented a constellation of cultural practices that set this community apart, not just from white American society, but from other African American communities as well. Let me walk you through the most documented ones. First, food laws. The Gullah Geechee community has historically maintained strict food prohibitions that do not map onto any West African animist tradition. Specifically, avoidance of pork in certain ritual contexts, avoidance of shellfish in certain ceremonial periods, and a clear distinction between animals considered clean and those considered ritually impure. Anthropologist Patricia Jones Jackson, in her 1987 study, When Roots Die, Endangered Traditions on the Sea Islands, documented elderly Gullah community members describing these prohibitions as simply the old way, unable to point to a specific religious teaching, but insisting the distinction mattered. When food anthropologists compared these prohibition categories to dietary codes documented in ancient Near Eastern societies, the overlap was not superficial, it was specific. Second, the ring shout. The ring shout is one of the most documented and analyzed ritual practices of the Gullah Geechee people. It is a communal ceremony involving counterclockwise circular movement, call and response singing, and percussive shuffling, always with feet never crossing. Musicologists and anthropologists have searched West Africa extensively for the direct antecedent to the ring shout and found partial similarities but no complete match. However, ancient Near Eastern ritual processions, documented in archaeological records from the Levant and descriptions in non-religious historical texts, share the counterclockwise orientation, the call and response structure, and critically, the prohibition against crossing the feet, which appears in ancient purification rituals. This is not a religious argument, this is a comparative anthropological observation, and it has never been adequately explained by the mainstream, purely West African origin model. Third, the naming system. This one stopped researchers cold. Lorenzo Dowell Turner, in his 1949 linguistic study, documented Gullah personal names that he traced not to West African languages, but to Semitic roots. Names like Abra, Amina, Samba, Hana, Dora, Yusuf in its Gullah form, Isa. These appear in Gullah naming traditions at a frequency Turner found impossible to explain through simple Islamic influence or coincidental overlap. Some names Turner documented had no Islamic equivalent. They matched Hebrew personal names from pre-Islamic Semitic traditions. Turner was careful. He did not make sweeping claims, but he flagged these names as an unresolved anomaly in Gullah linguistics. That was 1949. 75 years later, mainstream academia still has not resolved it. Now, I want to ask you directly, if you have Gullah heritage, or if your family has roots in the South Carolina or Georgia Low Country, does any of this sound familiar to you? Drop a comment, because the people who carry this history deserve to be heard. Now we get to the part that has the most direct, verifiable modern evidence, the genetics. Over the past 2 decades, commercial genetic testing combined with academic population genetics has produced a detailed picture of Gullah Geechee ancestry. Study after study confirms that the primary ancestral source populations for Gullah Geechee individuals are from West Africa, specifically from the Senegambia region, Sierra Leone, and the broader Upper Guinea coast. This matches the slave trade records exactly. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or more accurately, what has been quietly documented and then not widely publicized, is what happens when you look at the haplogroup distribution within those West African ancestral populations. A haplogroup is a genetic signature that traces deep ancestry, migrations that happened not hundreds, but thousands of years ago. The Y chromosome haplogroup E1b1b, specifically its subclade EM35, has been consistently identified in populations across the Middle East and North Africa, and is found at elevated frequency in populations associated with ancient Levantine or Near Eastern presence in Africa. Research published in peer-reviewed journals of population genetics, including work by geneticist Tishkoff and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, has documented that certain West African populations, particularly in the Senegambia region, carry genetic signatures that indicate ancient population contact or admixture with populations from the Near East. This contact is not recent. The genetic markers suggest this mixing occurred at minimum 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, meaning it predates the Atlantic slave trade by centuries, possibly by over a millennium. So the population that was captured, enslaved, and transported to the Sea Islands already carried within its genetic makeup the residue of ancient Near Eastern ancestry. Now, does the DNA prove definitively that Gullah Geechee people are descended from ancient Israelites? No, the DNA does not say that in those exact terms. Genetics does not come with ethnic labels from ancient history. But here is what the DNA does say. The ancestral population of the Gullah Geechee people includes genetic lineages with deep roots in the ancient Near East that were already present in West Africa before the slave trade, that match the geographic movement patterns consistent with ancient Levantine diaspora populations, and that have never been fully accounted for in the standard narrative of West African genetics. That is not nothing. That is a major underreported finding, and the question of why it has not been more widely discussed is a question worth asking out loud. Let's leave genetics for a moment and go back to paper, because the documentary evidence is just as compelling. Slave ship manifests from the South Carolina trade, many of which are now digitized and publicly accessible through the Transatlantic Slave Database, record the names of enslaved individuals at the point of embarkation and arrival. Researchers who have systematically analyzed these records have found a recurring pattern of personal names among individuals transported from the Senegambia region that include Semitic root names, names traceable not to Arabic Islamic tradition, but to pre-Islamic Semitic naming conventions. Names like Abraham, Dawood, Musa, Isa appear in manifests listing individuals from specific interior regions of Senegambia, where Islam had not yet achieved dominance at the time of capture. This matters enormously. If these names were purely Islamic in origin, we would expect to see them concentrated in coastal communities and trade centers, where Islam arrived first. Instead, they appear concentrated in interior populations, exactly where we would expect to find older, pre-Islamic Semitic cultural traces. The census records tell a similar story. Post-Civil War Freedmen's Bureau records for the Sea Islands, now housed in the National Archives, document Gullah Geechee surnames and community organization patterns that reflect extended clan structures, elder-based governance, and land inheritance customs that do not match West African communal land traditions as documented by anthropologists working in Sierra Leone and Senegambia in the same period. The Gullah Geechee organized in a very specific way: patrilineal extended clans, named lineages, elder councils with specific authority over ritual practice, and land held in common within the clan structure, not distributed individually or communally to the whole village. When anthropologists compared this structure to documented social organization in Sierra Leonean communities, the communities considered the direct origin point of Gullah ancestors, the structures did not match, but they did match closely the clan and governance structures documented in ancient Near Eastern settled communities. Again, not a match you can explain away as coincidence, not a match that mainstream historiography has ever satisfactorily addressed. Now we need to ask the hardest question. If this evidence exists, peer-reviewed genetics, linguistic anomalies documented in the 1940s, anthropological field reports, census data, slave ship manifests, why don't most Americans know about it? The honest answer requires us to look at how historical narratives get constructed, funded, and maintained. The dominant narrative of American slavery was built, in large part, to serve a specific function: to justify the enslavement of a people by denying them complexity. A slave system requires, at its ideological foundation, the belief that the enslaved have no sophisticated history, no ancient identity, no deep civilization, no continuity of culture worth preserving. The moment you acknowledge that the people being enslaved carry within their DNA, their language, their naming systems, and their rituals, the residue of ancient civilizations that predate Western history, the entire moral architecture of the slave system collapses. It is therefore not surprising that the research pointing in this direction was consistently underfunded, marginalized, or simply not followed up. Turner's 1949 work on Gullah linguistic anomalies was groundbreaking and was treated as a curiosity, not a call to systematic follow-up research. The population genetics data on West African Near Eastern haplogroup distribution has been published, but has never received the mainstream attention that equivalent findings in European genetic history routinely generate. The anthropological fieldwork on Gullah cultural practices has been documented, but framed consistently as African retention, without examining what specific African population, in what time depth, developed those practices, and why they resemble Near Eastern traditions. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It does not require a shadowy organization actively destroying evidence. It only requires a system in which certain questions are never quite funded, never quite followed up, never quite included in the curriculum, because the answers those questions might produce would be inconvenient. And inconvenient for whom? That is the question you should be sitting with right now. Before we close, we need to hear from the people whose story this is, because in all the academic papers, the genetic studies, the linguistic analyses, there is a risk of talking about a living community as if they are an artifact. They are not. The Gullah Geechee people are a living, contemporary community. Organizations like the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission and community leaders like Queen Quet, Marquetta L. Goodwine have spent decades insisting that the world pay attention to their story. They have not, in their mainstream public advocacy, made the Hebrew identity claim directly. That is important to acknowledge. But within the community, in oral tradition, in the stories passed from grandmothers to grandchildren on those sea islands, there are persistent accounts of an ancestry that is not fully explained by the standard narrative. Elders speaking of the old ways as having a source they cannot name. Community members who have taken commercial DNA tests and found haplogroup results that sent them searching for answers mainstream genealogy sites couldn't provide. And increasingly, a generation of young Gullah Geechee people who are running their own DNA, reading the linguistic studies, cross-referencing the anthropological field reports, and arriving at conclusions their own community has held in fragmentary form for generations. This is a community in the middle of rediscovering itself, and the evidence is there, waiting. Here is where we land. The Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia are the most culturally intact African-descended community in the United States. They preserved a language when every force of American society tried to destroy it. They preserved naming systems, food customs, ritual practices, and clan structures on isolated islands that became, unintentionally, a vault. And when modern science ran their DNA, and when linguists cataloged their words, and when anthropologists mapped their customs, what emerged was a picture of a people whose ancestry runs deeper and stranger and more ancient than the story America ever bothered to tell about them. Is every piece of evidence conclusive? No, science rarely offers that. But the convergence, genetics, linguistics, anthropology, documentary records, points in a direction that demands serious investigation. And the fact that this investigation has not been seriously, systematically, publicly funded and pursued, that tells you something too. The Gullah Geechee story is not finished. It is, in many ways, just beginning. And you, sitting wherever you are watching this, you are part of how this story gets told next. If you have taken a DNA test and found unexpected Semitic or Near Eastern haplogroup results in your ancestry, drop them in the comments. If your family has roots in the South Carolina or Georgia Low Country, share what your grandparents told you about the old ways. If you have Gullah heritage and any of what you heard today matched something you were told growing up, we need to hear it. Because the academic papers are one thing, the living memory of a people is another, and together those two things are more powerful than any single institution that has ever tried to bury this story. Subscribe, because this series is not done. Like this video if you think more people need to hear this, and share it, because the people whose history this is deserve an audience that takes them seriously. The Gullah Geechee are still here, still speaking their language, still practicing the old ways, still carrying in their blood and their memory a history that the textbooks never told you. Now you know. What are you going to do with that?